for now, we're just going to move on to JT Torres, who's written another one in the series, which is Taking Flight, and he's going to tell us some more about his book now and read from it for us. So I'd just like to introduce JT. JT Torres was born in Miami, Florida, into a family of Cuban immigrants who forbade him to travel to Cuba. He spent much of his life moving away from Cuba, traveling north for an MFA and a PhD. Eventually, he reached Alaska. Somehow, in the subarctic, he found passage to Cuba. Since then, he has spent 2 years traveling to and writing about the once forbidden island. JT, I'm delighted to welcome you to tell us some more about your book and to read from it.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I am also delighted to be here. So first and foremost, thank you, both Fairlight and everybody who's here for making this event happen. When I first started writing this book, which started as a life history of my real life grandmother, and also performing some ethnography, and I interviewed other people living in diaspora, primarily from Caribbean countries. And in writing this book, I did not think anybody would actually read it. So this is still very surreal. So thank you. So yes, this book did come out of, or the story came out of this project that I was doing that was meant to be nonfiction, meant to be ethnographic and partially biographical. But the stories that I was collecting, largely from my grandmother and others, were filled with pretty magical, what we would think of as magical, fantastical elements. Some stories were disputed by other storytellers, such as, my mom would tell me that my grandmother was lying to me in many of her stories. And then the questions of truth started to become very important and interesting to me in a very absurd, even humorous way. I found it quite funny, the stories that my grandmother would tell that would make other family members upset in terms of their supposed veracity. So I took off running in that direction with that brand of storytelling that really pushes those boundaries of truth. And the story just ventured into fiction, where names are fictional characters. I mean, they are fictional characters now. They're living and breathing as their own. And I just focused on the novella as a form that would allow me to really dive into these vignettes and images, this collage of an immigrant identity and the confusions and the absurdities that go along with it. So I will read pretty early on in the novella what I think gives the best introduction to the primary character, who is Nana. She's not the protagonist. The protagonist is a young boy, her grandson, but it's very much about this shared heritage of never really knowing what home is. Okay. It had been several years since Nana came to America from Cuba, but she never assimilated. She refused, referring to herself as an exile. No soy ciudadano, she would protest. America is where exiles live. She didn't make any friends. She never kept a job longer than a month, mostly because she told her bosses that she was not an American citizen, even though she actually was. And after my grandfather died, I was told, Nana needed a lot more attention. This presented a problem for me, a love-starved child. And so my mother had the idea of getting Nana a pet, but Nana never wanted a pet. So it worried my mother whether she'd actually take care of one. With that worry in mind, she decided on a more disposable animal, because pets are measured on a life value scale. Parents never start kids off, for example, with a dog, which ranks high. They get their potentially irresponsible children an ant farm, a goldfish, or a hamster, a more appropriate species for a child to accidentally murder. A parakeet, my mother's choice, also ranks low on this life value scale. In my earliest memories of my relationship with Nana, I felt directly threatened by her. I also hoped the parakeet would work. When we brought Nana her new pet, a neon dart and a silver wired cage, my mother explained that until school started in September, she would be very busy watching me and working for my father. I remember my mother holding me against her chest while she said this. I remember how her grip tightened, squeezed fear into my thigh. While I might not have been able to fathom the gravity of their conversation, I do remember the discomfort of her grasp and of Nana's sharp stare at both me and my mother. He's too big for you to carry him, Nana said. Put him down. You used to carry me home from school when I was 8, embarrassing me in front of my friends and teachers. You didn't listen to Dada when he told you to put me down. That was in Cuba, Nana said. Things are different in America. My mother always remarked how Nana was stubborn as a rock. Sometime during her 50s, Nana had a dentist remove all of her teeth because she didn't want to pay for a filling. My mother used to tell everyone that Nana's stubbornness is greater than pain. At the time, I was scared of Nana, scared that she was mad at me for something I didn't understand. When she talked about me to my mother, her voice cut. I bet he loves spending the day with you all the time, she said once. She walked around in platform shoes that made her taller than my mother, and my father, for that matter. Each step she took had the thunderous quality of crashing waves. I remember Nana as the savage queen of a verdant jungle. She lived in an apartment with brown walls, mulch-colored furniture, and rows of plants, dirt and several petals spilled from flower pots. It was where an exile would live. You don't try to make friends here, my mother finally said and walked towards the front door. My friends are in Cuba. Nana stopped a foot down. The earth trembled. The parakeet flew to the cage's ceiling. The plants rocked in their pots, and a few white petals floated to the floor. My mother squeezed me. I had never been to Cuba, where Nana was born. My parents had been there a number of times, but never spoke much about it. I imagined it looked just like Florida, but with mountains. Here in Florida, Nana was the only mountain. You've lived in Miami for 20 years now. My mother put me down and we walked to the car. As she loaded me in my car seat, I looked towards the apartment and saw Nana leaning on the railing, watching us. The shadow of her figure split the sun's light, and from inside the car, I could feel her loneliness. Nana named the parakeet Pepe, but that was all she did. Pepe was lime green with chalk blue circles around his eyes. When he lifted his white-tipped wings, he revealed yellow shadows on each side of his body. During our visits, I'd stare through the thin wires of the cage, and watch the bird bolt from corner to corner. I so badly wanted to hold Pepe, but feared Nana would yell at me to put him down. Once, when I was certain my mother and Nana were having coffee in the kitchen, out of view of the living room where the cage was, I slid my pinky through the individual wires and nudged Pepe. His feathers felt firm but flimsy, like they'd break apart into individual fibers and brittle bones. He had a certain edge, despite how fragile he appeared to be. When I nudged him a second time, he turned around and pecked me. I hollered, and when I noticed a drop of blood, I cried. My mother came running and scooped me into her arms. She took me into the kitchen and held a tissue over my injured pinky. Nana stared at me with a look as sharp as Pepe's beak, a look that I would later learn to identify as judgment. She said, "Don't poke around where you don't belong." When my mother and I showed up one week, several days after my pinky had healed, we found Nana crying on the sandstone patterned sofa. Pepe was lying on his side on the wicker coffee table, his eyes closed and body motionless. "Oh my God," my mother said and ran to Nana. She sat next to her and pulled Nana's face into the space between her neck and shoulder, shielding her eyes. I stood by the front door. Nana's apartment felt damp and cold. The air chilled my skin sweat. The apartment seemed to have become a much more dangerous place since the last visit. It was like I could sense predators lurking in the plants, hunting me from the hallway. Growing up in Florida, I would learn from school field trips to the Everglades to stand still if facing a black bear, run in zigzags if chased by an alligator, and avoid eye contact with a panther. What they never taught us was how to flee a wild grandmother. "He stopped moving after I bathed him," Nana said, sobbing with her hands in her lap, her fingers locked and her face buried in my mother's neck. "You bathed him?" The compassion in my mother's voice gave way to anger. "You don't bathe birds. He smelled bad. He's dead." My mother stood up from the sofa and went into the kitchen. She came back with a roll of paper towels and used them to wrap Pepe like a bird mummy. Then she carried him back into the kitchen. Nana's eyes were red and swollen. She looked much more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Without her false teeth to prop up her lips, her mouth drooped onto her chin. She looked at me and I felt her sadness. As a child, I did not know what that feeling was, but it felt familiar, like I was supposed to know it. "You don't bathe birds, Mom. I mean, that's common sense. You always scold me like I'm a child." My mother walked back into the living room with a long sigh, creating her own gust of wind. She told Nana to put on her shoes. "I can't leave you alone now." The sadness I sensed in Nana disappeared with a literal blink of the eye. It happened fast, without my mother noticing. And so we brought Nana back with us to our house, where she watched TV in the living room while my mother punched tax codes into the computer in her office. I crawled onto an empty shelf in one of the metal storage cabinets in the hallway, and from there spied on Nana. She seemed oblivious to the images flashing across the TV screen. Whenever the sound of laughter came from the speakers, she kept a stern expression, silent. All I could think about was Pepe. What had my mother done with his body? Did Nana kill him? Would Nana kill me? Pepe wasn't safe in a cage. Was I safe in a cabinet? And that's it.
Thank you so much, JT. That's an absolutely amazing reading. And it just gives such a sense of this incredible character of Nana, you know, she's so powerful and really quite scary, isn't she? And for a young child, I mean, goodness me, it's just wonderful. And, you know, really looking forward to talking more about your book, which I so enjoyed reading when we come to the Q&A. So thank you very much, JT. It was great.
Thank you.